So this is a talk actually my student Shane Clark gave at the ACM Hot Power Workshop just about 2 weeks ago out in Montana. But I thought this audience would be interested in some of the results, and that was we wanted to find about how to exploit hybrid energy harvesting, use other sources besides just RF, and see how much we really needed to do something useful. And so we attached some solar panels to a WISP to try to figure out what's the smallest panel that would be useful. Okay, so what we're calling this, we're using the WISP, but we're thinking more generally about a model, and so we call this model sort of the computational RFID model. That is a programmable RFID tag, unrestricted, batteryless, typically powered by RF and interacting with RFID readers. And as you can see, we've blown up the capacitor on one of the older WISPs, and it's quite small compared to your typical battery. So very small volume, very small weight, but can hold charge. So one of the challenges that we found in our lab, it took us about probably 2 years to get up to speed on the WISP. So I don't want to scare anyone away, but it did take a large amount of a learning curve, and I hope today we can avoid anyone having to spend 2 years on a learning curve like we did. But one of the problems is that the WISP was not originally too useful for our mobile situation when the tag is moving around. So if you can imagine the tag moving around, you've got the blue sort of area where the radio is able to actually bathe the WISP tag in enough energy to do something useful. It's actually not in that area all the time. So you can imagine that if it's outside, what are you going to do? How are you going to power it up? That makes it very difficult. So also when it's very far away, the RF harvesting might not reach it at all, and it's going to be very difficult to communicate. And as Josh kind of mentioned earlier in his slides, there are kind of two things at play, voltage and power, but they're going to be kind of hand in hand in constraining not only the read range, but the read rate. And here we're going to talk about how we use a little bit of solar to try to alleviate some of that pain. So here are a couple measurements of a WISP in our lab about the effects of distance. So you can see as you pull the WISP tag away from the reader from 0 meters to 2 meters, you get this huge drop-off. And that huge drop-off it's reads per second, but it's very, very similar in spirit to whether you can communicate at all. That after about 2 meters, it's just very difficult to communicate effectively. So we got low throughput after about 2 meters, and after 4 meters, forget it. You might as well go back to using something battery-powered for that particular model. So usually when we talk about this in the hallway, people say, "Oh, I got this great idea. Why don't you just do this?" And so I'm going to diffuse a couple of those ideas. Usually the first thing people say is just add a battery, which is great, but the whole reason was to remove the battery so that we wouldn't have to worry about recharging it, because it's not competing with a sensor mote, but it's trying to put sensing and computation in places where it'd be very difficult to maintain something. So like I said earlier, buried in concrete, it's going to be a lot harder to change a AA battery in concrete if you want it to last for 30 or 100 years. Rechargeable batteries also have very limited charge cycles. Another approach is to deploy many readers. So some people have done that. If you just bathe yourselves in radiation, you may have enough energy to operate the WISP, but it'd be nice if you could just get by with having, say, one reader. Another option is to use a supercapacitor, and Dan Yeager did this in one of his papers in 2008. So a supercapacitor, you can think of it as like a capacitor on steroids. For the same volume and weight, you get a huge amount of extra charge storage. But it's not a free lunch, unfortunately, because, as Josh mentioned earlier, there's a minimum voltage you need to have before you can do anything useful. And the problem with a supercapacitor, unlike a battery, is that as you're charging up, the voltage doesn't reach its peak right away. You got to charge it up pretty far before it's to a useful operating voltage. So you might find yourself charging overnight, before that supercap's able to do something useful. So it'd be nice if we could avoid having these really large charge up times. So really what this comes down to is you can do two different things, at least in our mind. You can either decrease how much energy is being consumed. So Josh was talking about Friis of Moore's law, or is it Moore's or Friis? So you can decrease energy consumption, but that's not something we do as application developers. We're not actually going out and building new microcontrollers. So we question whether we would be able to contribute much of having gains there. I think there's much to gain for the semiconductor folks. So instead we thought about, well, what if we could just increase energy production? And then the next question is, well, where do you get it, and how much do you really need? And you get by with just a tiny amount. So we did kind of the obvious first step, in that we said, well, solar's the easiest thing to actually take advantage of. It's widely available. So let's just add the second source. So, possible sources, solar, thermal, vibration, but solar turned out to be the easiest. Now, you might also think, well, why not just eliminate RF completely? You could eliminate RF completely if you really want for the harvesting, but you're going to have a lot harder time communicating if you don't have any RF. So it was sort of a necessary for us that we had both RF and some other alternative source to help us top off our capacitor. So again, the idea is energy harvesting. And what's our return on investment? We wanted to put as little change as possible on the device and yet get a huge bang for our buck, being able to do more computation with that small change. So our prototype solar WISP, here's the picture. It started with this sort of larger solar panel, and Shane could talk to you during the break if you're curious about things we've been doing lately. Roughly the size of the WISP panel, and that's pretty much it. We just literally, this was a simple hack. This initial thing was a simple hack, was just soldering right on to the capacitor to charge it up more quickly. And the question was, well, let's see how much this little panel would help. So here are the initial results. The blue line is this modified solar-assisted WISP. And as you can see, it's helping us in many ways. First of all, it's doubled the maximum read range. Now we can read things up to about 10.3 meters, whereas before we were only able to read things up until about 4 meters. It's also a much higher read rate. I believe it was about quadruple. And this was all from just adding a very small solar panel. And it's because it's kind of, the sun is everywhere, or even the fluorescent light, or even in the shade, we're able to gather enough energy to do useful things. Okay. But I think I'll just go on there to make room with time here. You can also kind of add the second bar here to think of. So on the left-hand side, we were judging the efficiency of our solar-assisted WISP by measuring reads per second. That's really the only measurement we're able to get reliably by using our RFID reader. It's much harder to figure out whether the WISP is actually operating in active mode or sleep mode. It takes a little bit more sophisticated measurement apparatus, but you can approximately transfer it over into duty cycle. It's not a one-to-one mapping, but you can think of it as 0 to 100% duty cycle depending upon read range. And so here, about 20% duty cycle by adding that small solar panel. So what does this buy us? Or what would adding a small amount of hybrid harvesting buy you at all? So solar alone allows us, we've been able to prove that, well, for instance, we can do timekeeping in near darkness. Maintaining a clock has been a problem we've been struggling with for years, especially with crypto. So in crypto and public key cryptography, you need certificates often, or you need expiration dates, or you need to have a replay cache. And if the WISP doesn't know what time it is, or has to get it from some trusted source, the game is over in terms of security. So the nice thing about the solar panel was it allowed us to keep the MSP430 microcontroller in a very low power mode that maintains a clock. So we know what time it is. That's great. It's even able to do much better. It's able to be in active mode about 50% of the time, 50% duty cycle when we're in a bright indoor light. So in here, I think we'd probably be able to be about 50% duty cycle. Shane and Jeremy, the other student, were also trying, I believe, under desks or something. Right. So it also works effectively even in shade. So this may or may not be surprising to you. It's surprising to us because we thought, well, if you don't have enough solar to bring your WISP up to active power mode, what's the point? But it turns out even being able to sleep well at night, is a good thing. And I wish I could sleep well at night. So that was all about increasing production of energy or energy harvesting. And the other side of the coin is decreasing our consumption. And we haven't made a whole lot of progress there, but we have some ideas that we'd like to share. Maybe some other peoples would like to follow up or think about this. So the first is to minimize capacitance.